the blurb I provided was extremely laconic. So I wanted to begin by, most of today we're going to concentrate on the major German painter, printmaker, two-dimensional artist, Albrecht Durer, and I believe we'll be doing him next week. I know we will be doing him next week as well. But to show you sort of the arc of what we're going to cover. So this is a late painting by Durer. It's not typical of his earlier work, and you'll know why in due time. But I think through this, you get a sense of how various the art will be, because here's a detail from a painting by his contemporary. This particular part of a scene is the temptation of St. Anthony. So you go from this sort of magisterial, calm, monumental figures to tortured fantasy, a wild imagination, marvelous color, just amazing. Look at this devil gripping a book, which, like him, is torn by thorns. So that's by someone who's absolutely Durer's contemporary. And a slightly younger contemporary of those two men was Hans Holbein the Younger, who's probably most familiar to people for this portrait he did of Henry VIII. Well, what's a German artist doing painting Henry VIII? In the 16th century, certainly before even the middle of the century, the market for German paintings just collapsed because the Protestant Reformation was absorbing the northern countries. And the Protestant Catholic, first of all, prior to this, the one stable source of commissions was religious art, whether it was for altars, for private chapels, for people to have cheap little devotional prints in their houses. And then, of course, there would be portraits, and then the wealthy, especially the extremely wealthy, well-educated, might have some other paintings. But the mainstay had been religious art. And with the Protestant, Martin Luther, but also Calvin's view that individuals should find their own way to the divine. There's not an intermediary in the church, just as now people ought to be able to read the Bible for themselves. They ought to be able to imagine religious scenes for themselves. Where's that kind of art go? So German painting, I don't know if it goes into decline, but certainly disappears from the books for quite a while. And what Holbein did was to move. He moved to England and then became a court painter. He came back once to Germany and then went back and painted again in England. He was a marvelous court painter, and that Frick has two very fine portraits by him. This is actually a copy of one by Holbein because the original was destroyed, but there are many, many copies of it. So we'll look at that. Oops. And then make a big jump to the 19th century, the very beginning of the 19th century, to a man named Caspar David Friedrich, who was a romantic artist. This is called a romantic, a wanderer above the sea of fog. An art like this supposedly made the increasingly urbanized public, they felt chills, they felt emotional reactions to this. This is the sublime of nature as they're moving into the cities and they're looking at this, and they're very precise and very detailed and have kind of a spectral quality to them. And then we go to the 20th century. where we're going to look at art that is reflecting the absolute turmoil of German 20th century history with World War I and World War II. This is a work by he's a Norwegian German artist, Emil Nolde, from 1911, and it's just called Masks. This is the sort of art that the Nazis were confiscating and refusing to have seen. This is what we call degenerate art, with its extraordinary expressiveness, its individuality, its haunting quality, that they saw no moral or educational uplift in this at all. But it was an expression of some artists reacting to the horrors of World War I. Sometimes not like one-to-one, that's why I'm doing this, but that was sort of the direction for that. And then we will look at some interwar art from the 20s, particularly, sometimes called the New Objectivity. And this is art that is often just laden with witty but critical social commentary and a kind of an alienating tone. It's very distinctive. This particular painting is by a man named Otto Dix. And this is George Groves, and it's just called A Gray Day. See, there's a wounded soldier, a black marketer back here, a workman, and the bureaucratic functionary with his cross eyes. And from that same period, this is the one by Otto Dix, a portrait of a well-known lesbian journalist in Berlin. So they're sort of recounting the atypical people who flocked to Berlin, found refuge there, had a very active literary culture. Now, very interesting detail in here, other than her elongated face. This became a fashion for a while for women to wear monocles, but those long claw-like hands. But look at the sheer disarray here that her stocking is rolled down. But the sophistication as she is drinking her drink, smoking her cigarette. This is the ultra chic Berlin society before World War II. And we'll look at work of Max Beckmann, who immigrated to the United States. He was persecuted by the Nazis. This is a 3-part painting he did that's just called Departure. And this is in the Museum of Modern Art. It's also extremely expressive and expressive of still deep, quiet, and unease. It looks basically some parts here like a religious image, but it's not religious. But it's torture. And then a mother and child and kings here. It's again, social commentary. And then the last artist we'll deal with is Anselm Kiefer, who's a contemporary artist. And by some kind of wonderful, unexpected poetry, when I pulled out this image, it's a very big painting. It's about 12 feet across, maybe even more than that. It's called Nuremberg. Well, his art takes on history, including German history. There's in the fields here around Nuremberg, Hitler held many of his rallies. This is where also the Nuremberg trials, post-World War II, trials of German war criminals were held. And Nuremberg is the city where Durer lived. So now we go back to Durer. I'm operating on an assumption. If I'm wrong, That's too bad. This is one of those artists I have a crush on. My assumption is that many people don't know all that much about him and probably don't know that he's ranked in the pantheon of the High Renaissance, up with Raphael, Michelangelo, Leonardo, and Titian. He's the Northern European artist who had the kind of visionary quality, the intellectual quality, the productivity, the innovative nature, and just the sheer genius that those men had. Durer, however, unlike the other ones, Titian only painted. But you think of Michelangelo as a painter, sculptor, and architect. Leonardo was a painter, but he, in his drawings, was planning architecture. He was also a military engineer and an anatomist. So he had that scientific range of interests. Raphael was an architect and a painter. But Durer works, as far as I know, almost exclusively in 2 dimensions. And his work, we'll see, is full of pulling together opposites. He goes to Italy. In Italy, we'll see more. He spent 2 years in Venice. The Venetians begged him to stay there as a permanent resident, but he came back north. So he was drawn to Italian art, to the ideas, and had friends among Italian artists. But he felt the draw of his native heritage and evidently an obligation to bring what was new north. And so his work will have those opposites, and it will combine more typical northern characteristics, which were a love of incredibly fine detail, with Italian preference for idealizing, simplifying classical principles, and he'll put them together, as well as doing some new things. Now, that's all just based on his name. So let's look at some images. The first 2, I'm thinking, if anybody knows anything about Durer, or they don't know anything about Durer, these would be images that would be most familiar. This drawing he did it's a pen and ink heightened with white, and especially made by him in very expensive blue paper of just the praying hands. One sign of this, the great familiarity of this image, is that Andy Warhol had this engraved on his tomb. So for a long time, it was thought to be that this was a preparatory drawing for an altarpiece that Durer did. But then, upon further reflection, to use this really expensive paper and this extreme, the fineness of all this, it looks so in itself studied, that no, maybe this is meant as an independent drawing, which would be something new to be doing, valuing drawings just as works of art in themselves. Leonardo's drawings were working drawings. They weren't meant to be distributed by people and just enjoyed as art. And in fact, now there's a recent work is thinking, maybe these are Durer's own hands, because there's this arthritic little finger that he had. So we might get quite close to the man with that. But it's used as a religious image now. Or this one, I thought people would likely to know. It's just called The Large Piece of Turf. Large because it's a fairly large watercolor. We'll see in this combining things that are opposite. Not only is Durer unusual in his interest in landscapes, but he takes panoramic landscapes and then he comes down to a single plant, or here a single clump that looks as if he were actually almost on the ground studying it, where you can see some of the roots of the plants here. And this is a watercolor. one thing it most certainly shows is his extraordinary skill in watercolor to lay one color on top of another without muddying them, and to get all this range of greens. As far as I know, these are all botanically accurate representations. And what I know is here, but I don't see it, is that it has his monogram on it. I'm thinking, I don't think it's this. I don't know where it is. So that's what I'm going with the assumption. You know those. And then we'll start something about his life. Then I want to show you his self-portraits and then come back and do bits, because he goes in so many different directions. But this wonderful drawing, which he made of himself in 1493. Oh no, here's another factoid I want to give you to get you started. From him, still surviving, 60 paintings, 250 woodcuts, 96 engravings, 6 etchings, 3 dry points, and countless drawings and watercolors. So as productive as Leonardo was. Not Leonardo, not in paintings, of course. So this drawing, this is his self-portrait. He did this when he was 13. And he did this in dry point, which was a very challenging medium. Pencil was not so common yet, though, but in dry point, what you have is a sort of a stylus that's silver. And as you move the stylus, there's a trace of the silver that's on the paper. And that's then what becomes the black. Well, this is something you can do no erasure. You have to have the confidence that whatever line you put down there is the line you wanted forever. And you can see something here that having put the hair down, then Durer said, no, he wanted a little more dark in that area to offset the silhouette. So he added these lines. So you can see where, had he been able to make some change, he might have done it. But this, he was 13, so it's a very precocious drawing. The text up here is his, not done at the time. This is what he said. This I have drawn from myself from the looking glass in the year 1484, when I was still a child, Albrecht Durer. Well, why would he do that? This is a man who has the confidence that what he has done is going to matter to posterity, and he's also keeping a very good record of himself. And there are diaries, notebooks, letters. So he comes to life as a person. So he just has that sovereign sense of himself that people are going to want to know, I did this, how I did this, and at that age. He was the son of a goldsmith. This is his very first painting that we know of, done in 1494. And it is the portrait of his father, the goldsmith. It was Albrecht Durer, the elder, whose family came from a long line of goldsmiths from Hungary. And he married the daughter of his master, which is the way many artists got ahead. So there was craft of using lines, engraved lines in metal, that's deep in Durer's heritage. Now, when we say goldsmiths, I suppose from the 20th century point of view, think of painters as being more important. But goldsmiths were highly esteemed, and say major courts might have just a goldsmith that was their goldsmith that worked only for them. Well, Durer first studied with his father, but because of that precocious drawing skill and undoubtedly his own interests, he then was at age 15 apprenticed to another man, I'll show you a little later, who was a painter and maker of woodcuts. So he had a training in painting. And this early one, you still see some awkwardness in this. He's showing his father as a deeply pious man, holding his beads here. But this very northern interest in all the details. If you're familiar with earlier 15th century Flemish art, say Jan van Eyck, you'd know like each one of these wrinkles, each bit of shadow there from his whiskers would be something that was, that representation would be prized in their art. But the portraits we're going to look at, the painted portraits first, are of Durer himself. This is not a painted portrait, obviously. And this is a drawing that the Met owns. It's like all their drawings and prints, they're very seldom on display because the medium is too fragile. Ink would fade and the paper would discolor. But this was just a trial sheet. On this side is Durer's head, his hand, and a pillow. On the reverse of this, there's 6 different studies of the pillow, where he's studying the way cloth crumples and to do the light and shade. Now, in this one, on the back, there's also, not here, but on the back, it gives the date of 1493. You can see he's looking at himself in the mirror. And is looking very clear-eyed at himself. The hand would be done separately. Now, this would, because I think he was right-handed, so this would be the hand in action. His left hand he can hold up and see in the mirror, see what it looks like, not from the side he sees when he looks at his hand. And that probably was done while he'd finished his apprenticeship, and he, in the typical still medieval fashion, would have several years called the wander years, where an artist would travel to different cities, briefly apprenticing himself with various artists whom he admired, picking up contacts, picking up tips, beginning to make himself known. Not too much is known about that time. We know a couple cities he went to, and we know he was trying to contact one of the finest printmakers of his day, Martin Schongauer, but Schongauer died almost the minute he reached the city where Schongauer lived. But this was done while he's still in those wander years, but it's done probably as a preparation for this self-portrait. This is from 1493 also. And it's just called Self-Portrait with a Thistle. It's not quite 2 feet high, and it's in the Louvre when you go there. And it's one of the very first self-portraits of an artist. Even the Jan van Eyck that's sometimes called his self-portrait, Man in a Red Turban, it's not explicit that that's himself. And this one, it is. I think he has his monogram on it. But the thought is that this was a portrait that he made to send home when he's wandering to his bride-to-be, a woman named Agnes Fry, whom he'd never met because the marriage was arranged by his father. And the marriage would be important not for getting Durer to settle down or anything like that, but for Durer to be able to advance, to become a master artist and to have his own workshop, he had to be married. So this is a use of portraits that was very familiar in the Renaissance, and even, well, mainly in the Renaissance, for, say, dynastic or marriage among the wealthy who didn't, the young people might not see each other, but there would be an exchange of portraits. So you could see this would be a good person who's got property that, or would make a sort of a strategic alliance with us. You know, how does this person look to you or that? So these portraits had this absolute social function, not just an ego function. But it is unusual for an artist to decide for himself, to send for his potential bride. The reason I think this is related to his marriage is the Thistle in Germany. Evidently, the word is monstroi, which means a faithful man. But as is so common in Durer's art, there are multiple explanations possible, because it could also be an allusion to Jesus when he's tortured before he dies and he's given a crown of thorns. Because Durer was a man of deep faith. He'll later be good friends of some of the reformers, somewhat a friend of Luther, and certainly a friend of Erasmus. The next time you'll see a portrait by he did of Erasmus. But there is that element of faith in him always. So it could be either one. But it's a wonderful portrait showing his long reddish gold locks and quite sensitive face, full mouth, looking out here at us. This is the only work we have that he did of his wife. And it says, my Agnes Fry. And there's his monogram, the AD, that you'll see again and again. This was not a happy marriage. Later on, with his very good friend, one of the leading German humanist scholars, a guy named Willibald Pirkheimer, whom you'll see in point, they used to make really nasty comments about her to one another in their letters. I mean, they just found her a shrew and utterly unappealing. So nowadays it's kind of fashionable to wonder whether Durer would have ever chosen to marry. But anyway, he married her. He was able to become master. And 3 months after he married, he goes to Italy. Now, he could have been seeing some of the Renaissance Italian revival of antiquity, staying at home, but to really absorb it and to move into that, of course, he had to go to Italy. So he comes to Nuremberg. I checked it out on you can Google and find anything now. You can't be sure it's true. But what I found was that it would take about 10 days travel to get from Nuremberg over the Alps down to Venice. So he went to Venice. That was his location. But other artists came, and there was other Italian art in Venice, not just Venetian. So it could be either while he was still in Nuremberg or when he just got to Italy. He saw this. This is now a work by an Italian artist, by the artist named Andrea Mantegna. And it's an engraving, The Battle of the Sea Gods. And this was very widely distributed because, again, if you think back to this time, paintings didn't travel. They're just too fragile. And paintings would be in churches, in private collections. There were no such things as museums. So artists who had access to other paintings would sometimes make copies of them, or an artist's workshop might make copies to distribute of them. But the spread of paintings was quite limited until in the later part of the 15th century, there was one man in particular who made a career out of making printed copies of paintings. So they could go anywhere. I mean, they could go up to Norway. They could go anywhere. And so that's how ideas really began to spread. And Montaigne is a very fine artist. There are several paintings by him in the Met. He was wonderful with anatomical studies. This is based partly on a study of a Roman sarcophagus, a statue that we know is in Rome. But okay, I can't do Montaigne now. Here we do. This is Durer's drawing. I wish I could show the two of them to you at once. About the only real difference I saw, and I'm toggling back and forth looking at one and the other, is that Durer isn't at all interested in the reeds in the background. So he just does a really cursory few lines here and there sketching. But this drawing is extremely careful and very accurate in exactly where this arm overlaps her breasts, or this is a little bit different. The water's a little bit different down here too. But most of this is very, very close. So Durer is beginning to learn by getting body memories of this new way of work. It's just going to come into him because he's now learning how to move his hand like that, make those shapes. And you know how closely you have to study it if you're making a facsimile drawing of that. So he's just soaking this in. We have to imagine, it's not known really what he was doing in those not very many months probably that he was in Italy. I mean, who he saw, well, probably he went to Mantua, maybe he went to Padua. We know he was in Venice. How much other traveling he did, unknown. When he came home reluctantly, as he wrote to his friend Wilbard Pirkheimer. Let's see if I've got what he said about this. Yes, this is what he wrote to, we'll call him Willie, which is absolutely incorrect, but said, so to his friend, he writes before he comes home, "How shall I freeze after this sun? Here I'm a gentleman, at home only a parasite." Because in Italy, artists were considered that they were practicing one of the liberal arts. They were, by this time, valued. And that came because the Italian Renaissance had absorbed the ancient Greek attitude, in particular, that artists were important. In the North, artists were still craftsmen, just as he's going through the crafts system with his wander years and his guild system. So he's had an experience of being in a place where he is appreciated, admired, enjoyed among other people who are artists, just a milieu where he feels perfectly wonderful. Well, he comes back and then he does this portrait. This one dates from 1498. And you see, always he puts his monogram, and frequently he will put additional information on the image. The monograms, when we get to the prints, they're even there. That turns out to be significant, but I hope I remember, if I say this, now that I remember when we do the prints that I mentioned that. But so look how he presents himself as a gentleman. In elegant clothing, he's wearing kidskin gloves, no seeing the craftsman's hands there, with a wonderful view out into a landscape. Now that comes from Northern art. But this pose, the dignity, the way that sort of makes the same L shape as the window here, this kind of like a coherence in the composition, that's coming from his awareness of what Italian art is like. There's a kind of hauteur in this, isn't there? In the way he looks out at you, not exactly looking down, but almost. So here you have a detail. I was reading one curator's description of this one, saying how much to her this seemed to combine the aspects of his sensuality, as in his very full mouth, and his absolutely direct, appraising gaze, both the intellect and the sensual there together. This fine detail, this love of line, oh, you'd say that'd be Leonardo's like that too, but it's certainly a characteristic of that whole background he has with goldsmiths and lines. I don't think I have, I don't. There, you can see the eyes. This was a trick he uses. Those little flecks of light, of course, that presents a liquid on the eye, but it also seems to suggest that there's a window in the studio, and that's the light from the window, and it's being reflected then that he's from looking at himself in the mirror. This painting he gave to his hometown, to Nuremberg. I should say one about this, the previous one. This is on vellum. This is on paper. Aha, see, he knew this was going to be sent someplace. So rather than having the bulk potential damage of a wood panel, you have something you can roll up. So it was a couple centuries after it was made that it was finally put on a panel. And this self-portrait. This is from 1500. It's not quite 2 feet high, and it's in Munich. There's his signature with 1500 above it. Now that's kind of interesting. Not only is it his signature, but you could read this as Anno Domini, the year of our Lord, 1500. And then moving right across at the level of his steady gaze right out at us, making sure we're looking at that level of the painting, because of course we look where the eyes are. Then over here, I, Albrecht Durer of Nuremberg, portrayed myself in everlasting colors, age 28 years. It's a pose that would be more associated with Christ or the all-powerful God, with a gesture of blessing. Here it is holding, and if that were the meaning here, also with his lovely long locks, that would also fit a more traditional Christ imagery. This would be perfectly in keeping with a deep religious faith where the goal is to live a Christ life like. So this could be a statement of his aspiration rather than a statement of his hubris. 1500 is a significant year, and it's going to play into what the next things we're looking at, because many people thought that in the year 1500, the world was going to come to an end. But before we get to the end of the world, I'm just getting ahead of myself, something more with his drawings. Like, what? This drawing? This is a drawing by Raphael. Yeah, but it's owned by Durer. And Durer wrote on it here. You said, how I wrote this exactly. Raphael has sent this in 1515. Raphael of Urbino, who is so highly regarded by the Pope, asserts that he has made this new drawing and sent it to Albrecht Durer of Nuremberg to show and to demonstrate to him his skill. Well, one of the things that Durer did with his self-portraits, it is not some only devotional sense. What are you going to do with self-portraits? Is it just your ego that you're going to spend that time, that money, apply your assistance to doing that? No. He sent them out to fellow artists that he wanted to meet. And here he doesn't have to pay, with doing that, he doesn't have to pay for a model. And you don't have to set up a subject. People will see what he looks like. They will see how he paints. So we know he did many more than survive. And we know that he sent a self-portrait to Raphael. And this is a drawing that Raphael sent back in exchange. Raphael evidently sent other works as well. Now, Raphael was a very well-established artist by this time, and Durer was still fairly much establishing himself. This is a drawing that was for a fresco that's in one of the rooms in the Vatican that Raphael painted. So that's another use of self-portraits. And we're about to move back in time and start some of the progress in his career. This is a portrait he did, you see, I don't need to say, you can say it yourself, 1516, Albrecht Durer. This man is a man named Michael Wohlgemuth. This is the man that he was apprenticed to by his father in Nuremberg when he decided that he wanted to become a painter. And Wohlgemuth was a major figure in Nuremberg. He was a painter, and then he was also a printmaker, and he had shops even abroad because he printed many, he made the illustrations for many books. This is a very fine, sort of psychologically, you get the idea that an aging man, but still a very sharp-witted man here. And he happened also to be Durer's godfather. Largely although he went to Wohlgemuth's studio to learn to paint, what he largely did early on was woodcuts. Now we're getting into the métier printmaking, which is the one for which Durer is now most famous. And this is not by Durer, but just an example of woodcuts were in the 15th century very popular. This is the kind of art that would be accessible to everybody. I mean, especially printing was more and more after the printing press was developed in the early 15th century. There were just more printed works of all sorts. This very simple one shows, well, you've all done you must have done a potato print or a linoleum print or something like that. So, you know the technique that you cut away everything except where you want the line to be. So these would be the lines left. All the rest of the wood block would be cut back. And then the wood block would be inked and pressed on the paper. And then you'd re-ink it and there'd be another one. But on many woods, unless you have very fine quality wood, you have to worry about the grain of the wood. And you don't want to make the lines too thin because possibly they'd break. So there's a skill involved. Now, actually this comes out just a couple of years after Durer finished his apprenticeship with Wohlgemuth. But what Wohlgemuth was busy illustrating subsequently, and that maybe Durer saw in progress, the beginning stages for that was an enormous book, the biggest book of the 15th century, called the Nuremberg Chronicle, of some 300 pages, some 1,800 woodblock prints in them, as supposedly a universal history of the world from the beginning. And also topographical. It had everything. It was an encyclopedia. It had everything. And I'll just show you 2 pages. This is the first family. So this would be Adam and Eve with their children. And some copies of the book were then hand painted. So this, and you see it's more delicately done than that simple one I showed you. Or this, which is supposedly the city of London. So these are the kinds of woodcuts that of about Durer's time. And here's one by Durer. This is his Samson killing the lion, a biblical story where Samson kills a lion and eats from it honey. This is from 1498. Look at the depth of the blacks that he's able to get here and the complexity of the line. Now, it's unlikely that in the woodcuts that Durer actually cut them himself. He probably just provided the designs. And the Met actually owns the woodblock itself. Let's see if I can hardly make it out here. It's very rare for the woodblocks to survive. But you see the lines. And his signature. So this he would sell independently. One reason then that when he left Wohlgemuth's shop, Durer concentrated on woodcuts and then engravings, is that he's not dependent on any patron there. He doesn't have to wait till someone hires him. He doesn't have to have the financial resources that having a number of assistants help him with a painting would require. And not only that, he makes multiple copies so he can sell many of them for less money, spread his reputation, his style further. It's a win-win for him. So there's very skilled woodcutters working for him. The size of this altogether is, let's see, look at this guy. No, I didn't write it down. But they're less than a size of a page of typing paper. They're just technical marvels. And then, again, as an innovator, Durer prints and publishes a book himself. And he's one of the first artists to do that. And the book he published was an apocalypse. It consisted of 16 prints from passages in the Apocalypse, the book of Revelations in the Bible. It's not known if anyone helped him choose which ones. He may have just chosen the illustrations himself. The pages are arranged that there's an illustration on one side, and then opposite that, there's the relevant text, so that readers would have a chance to take in the information in these two forms. That was actually was a big deal in ancient and Italian art, whether storytelling is more effective and you retain a story better with an image or with words. So he's putting the two of them together. This particular page, let me give you the size for this one. This is 14.5 by 11, so it's a little bigger than a typing page. And this is the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. I'm not going to read the whole passage, but just to give you some sense of what he's taking on. The passage in the Bible describes St. John seeing, over a space of some time, 4 horsemen. And the text describes there's first a horse. The first one that appears is a horse in white. Its rider had a bow, and a crown was given to him. Then the next, and he went out to conquer everyone. Then there's a red horse came next, and on it there was a man with a mighty sword. He was to take peace away from the world. Then there's a black horse, and I don't remember what it is the man on the black horse is supposed to do. I think it's so, I'm not really sure. I better not say. And then a pale green horse who represents death. And behind him follows Hades, and there's the mouth of Hades. You can't, in a print, suggest the color. And the text describes something happening over time. Now, how do you collapse that into a single image and still suggest sequence, not just this is this horse, this horse, this horse, which has been the more standard way of doing it? Well, he does it partly by having them project on, they're going on this diagonal. This one is furthest over, so the movement is in this direction. And that's also, from our point of view, since all four horses have appeared, the one that was first in time. So that's farthest to go from us. This is closest in time, so that's closest to us. So he has arranged them so that they give the sense of the direction of the narrative. And they are full of figures who are dressed in clothing of the 15th century. And here's, I think this is meant to be a pope here. Because as I say, this is the year 1500 that thought the world was coming to an end. So this is a call on people before the end times, before Revelation, to reform. So you have this tremendous image. There's the detail. The haggard, frenzied death. This one I will read you because I think, what kind of artist would even dare to take this on to illustrate? It's St. John devours the book. Now, I'm not going to read you the whole passage, but from reading it, just try to imagine. Well, you can't imagine what I'm showing you, what you would do, but it says, this is, so St. John is speaking. And I saw another mighty angel coming down from heaven, wrapped in a cloud, with a rainbow over his head. His face was like the sun, and his legs like pillars of fire. He held a little scroll open in his hand. Setting his right foot on the sea and his left foot on the land, he gave a great shout, and then he shouted, and some things go on. And then the voice that I heard from heaven spoke to me again, saying, "Go, take the scroll that is open in the hand of the angel who is standing on the sea and on the land." So I went to the angel and told him to give me the little scroll. And he said to me, "Take it and eat. It will be bitter to your stomach and sweet as honey in your mouth." So I took the little scroll from the hand of the angel and ate it. It was sweet as honey in my mouth, but when I had eaten it, my stomach was made bitter. So an angel with legs that are like pillars of fire. And then that he's actually showing literally eating the book. What daring. There's the wonderful sea, there's a sea creature, and then some swans peacefully here, someone in a rowboat. This is that northern interest in great landscapes. And if you were to own this book with all 16 illustrations, of course, you would look at it again and again. So each small part, the ink pot, calipers he has here, each one of these things you would look at repeatedly. And the other one to show you from that is the St. Michael slaying the dragon at the end, where there's a much more explicit, idyllic landscape, vast landscape. So it's mountains, fields, sea, is essentially the whole natural world presents itself there. And this is a many-headed dragon. The heads, these are sort of conventional northern conceptions of what the monsters would look like. He also did a series of the Passions. So this is all around 1498, and then this book of the Passion of Christ, he did 5 different versions of it during his lifetime. But I'll show you this illustration from 1498 and one from 1510, after he's been back to Italy and spent 2 years in Italy. But this one with, again, this is actually not even a little bit smaller, I think, than a typing page. This one is the Flagellation of Christ, and this is one that's for sure done in 1498. And it still appeals to a northern audience because it's congested with so much detail. There's no space. I mean, he shows like perspective back here, but when you get to the people, none. And you can hardly make out one from the other. It's kind of incoherent. Body image, look at body proportion. Now, where would that leg join? Or this peculiar body here? But oh, so much wonderful detail. Now, he knew perfectly well how to make a coherent, 3-dimensional, plausible body. This is appealing to the style of the North. And then in 1510, this is one of the final ones he added to that series, the Last Supper. You know, he's aware of Leonardo's Last Supper. And this has this simplicity and clarity that's very much like Italian High Renaissance work. Here is Judas separated on this side of the table. On his plate, there's a knife, interestingly, directed right toward Christ. And in perspective, as if it were part of the scene, his signature. I'll show you one more, was just still in the early part of his career, an engraving he did, because about the same time he began to do engravings. They were slightly more expensive, somewhat more fragile, and allowed for far more delicate line. And these, he would have made all the line himself. There's not a craftsman who's gouging into the metal plate to make the lines. That's all Durer's own work. And this is the Last Supper, or Last Supper, Prodigal Son, from around 1496. It's even a little bit earlier than those woodcuts. So it's the biblical story of a young man who asks his father to divide his fortune and give it its inheritance to his kids while they're still alive. Rembrandt makes the most wonderful painting from this. And the one son takes it, who's persuaded his father to do it, takes the fortune, squanders it, is penniless, finds himself actually working as a swineherd. Now, for a Jew to be working, caring for the pigs, of course, is the ultimate of degradation. And in the text, this is part of it, then the part not that Rembrandt shows. Father, I have sinned against heaven and before thee. I'm no more worthy to be called thy son. Make me one of thy hired servants. Because he's realized these pigs eat better than I do. I'm going to go back to my father and beg his forgiveness. There's still a little bit of sign of early work here. This marvelous barnyard field and the buildings behind that don't cohere with the scene that goes across here with the pigs and the prodigal son. These are sort of all smushed together. There's no transition. Vasari, the great writer of biographies of Italian Renaissance artists, even who never would deign to write about anybody who wasn't Italian, wrote about this print. So he saw it in Italy, saying the marvelous huts in the German style. I give you. Here's a preliminary drawing he did for it. He did a lot of drawings of these wonderful hairy pigs too. And that background. Now, these are Durer's lines. He catches line on the building, light on the top of the trees, light catching some places, maybe here on plaster. I don't know about you, but I could just look at something like this for a very long time. But you're not going to get to now, because now the time is up. And next time, we're going to get to some more of his most famous prints. And I will stop if you have questions, comments. Now's the time. Please unmute. Okay, someone asked, how about earlier artists than Durer would have traveled and discovered art? Actually, there was more travel than we think, especially by waterways. And is largely someone having access to something, then making a painted copy of it. But early on, or I'm thinking of it like Flemish artists. Flemish artists, their works were bought in Italy because people liked them once they saw them, because there had been Italian merchants who were living in Flanders. So they could commission things there, and then when they returned home to Spain, they took them with them. So it really traveled through the patrons. Some artists traveled, but the best way to get access was through what other people had collected. How did Durer know to go to Venice? Well, that was the largest near city. Venice was also a great printing center, and Nuremberg was a great center of printing. So there was a kind of a natural connection there, I believe. How he got there? Probably by horseback. No, he went over the Brenner Pass, but I think by horseback. Now, any questions?
Maggie?
Yeah. Can you?
Yeah. It's Carolyn. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Were there many artists that put more than their signature on their paintings and their work?
Oh, thank you. No. This is when his prints started to be spread, and they were like instantly going across, getting to Italy, going everywhere. That Apocalypse series in particular. This canny Italian who was making a career out of copying works of art started copying Durer's prints. And it had to go to the Venetian Senate, had to rule that that man was not allowed to put Durer's monograph on them. This is one way, they didn't have copyright. This is one way Durer was trying to hold them as his own. Plus, he had that strong sense of himself as important, but it's so that others won't steal it, so that he gets the fame.
But what about all the writing that he had on his works? Was that done by other painters?
Sometimes. It's not an Italian habit, but some other northern artists did. Yeah.
Okay.
I know next time we will get out of Durer and into that wonderful phantasmagorical and sometimes difficult to look at painting. No more? All right, well, I hope many of you return. Yeah. Yes, Carolyn, what?
No, I'm just saying thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. It was fascinating.
I hope to see you next week.